So time then for the press preview. It's our first look at what is on the front of Sunday morning's papers. And tonight we'll see what's making the headlines with the journalist and author Rachel Shabi and the former Conservative advisor Anita Boateng. Good evening to you. Speak in a moment. First of all, let's take a look at some of those front pages for you. Why don't we start with The Observer, leading on next week's budget plans with the headline Sunak's £5 billion plan to rescue high streets from collapse. And it's the budget which also features in the Sunday Telegraph, which says that the Chancellor plans new taxes for online deliveries and freelance workers. And the Sunday Times, stealth rise in income tax to pay COVID bill, the headline there. The Scotland on Sunday has the headline ready for the fight of her life in reference to Scotland's First Minister giving evidence next week in the Salmond inquiry. Here's your Mirror leading on the funeral of Captain Sir Tom Moore with the headline, His Spirit Lives On. And the Sunday People also has a tribute to the war veteran and fundraiser. And I'm joined tonight by Rachel Shabi and Anita Boateng. Great to see you this Saturday evening. Anita, why don't we start with you? Front page of the Sunday Telegraph. It's on all the front pages, or certainly all the broadsheets. The budget's on Wednesday, and it's going to be hugely significant, isn't it? The paper's all taking a slightly different take on things. The Telegraph going with Sunak plots tax raid on parcels and freelance workers.
Yes, and I certainly don't envy the Chancellor, because I think this is going to be one of the toughest budgets for a Chancellor to navigate, certainly of the last 5 years. It's going to provide, as the Telegraph speculates, a mix of ongoing support, so some continued support around, extension of the furlough, possibly stamp duty holiday, but also, as the Telegraph really focuses on, a real attempt to broaden the tax base in order to manage what is going to be a very difficult and bumpy period economically. And the real challenge from the Chancellor, which we can see coming through the Telegraph, is that politically and economically, the two cycles, don't quite match up. Ideally, the Chancellor would want to be more cautious in terms of balancing the books right now, so as not to choke off a recovery. But politically, if he waits too late, you're too close to an election to really increase taxes. And that is a fine line the Chancellor is going to be trying to walk next week.
Yeah, he's damned if he does, he's damned if he doesn't, Rachel, isn't he? And, of course, the Conservatives promised no tax rises, didn't they? I mean, do you think people would understand, given everything that's happened over the last 12 months, if he has to bend the rules somewhat or bend that promise?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because the public has always consistently been in favour of higher tax for the highest earners and favoured hikes in corporation tax as well. And we can see that reiterated now in the most recent polling shows that now in the midst of a pandemic, of course, support for those tax measures is still there, if not more so. And I think that when we look at this budget this week, a lot of it will be, the focus for a lot of it, I think, will be on where is the tax coming from? Who is it that's being taxed? Now, it looks like the Chancellor is talking about an online tax, so looking at companies that have done so well when so many of us have only been able to shop online. But on the other hand, it's looking like he's backing away from a windfall tax, which just does look like a missed opportunity. We do not want a situation when the people worst affected by the pandemic are hit even harder in the recovery from it. And a windfall tax is such a great way to make sure that doesn't happen. It looks at taxing companies like Amazon, which Amazon UK had 50% increase in sales in the pandemic year. Serco, a company that got billions in contracts using public sector money for private contracts, made 36% increase in profits this year. The idea that you wouldn't put a windfall tax on companies like that does seem bizarre.
Anita, front page of The Observer, again, Sunak's £5 billion rescue plan to stop high streets from collapse. I mean, the big fear, of course, is employment and the issues that we're going to face this year with millions of people struggling to keep their jobs. The Chancellor wanting to offer 700,000 shops, pubs, restaurants, etc. These grants. And, of course, it's young people, isn't it, who work in the hospitality sector who are most likely to suffer. I mean, do you think this will go far enough, this £5 billion?
I think the Chancellor is doing absolutely everything possible to keep as many jobs as possible. But ultimately, we are in a situation where there is a huge unknown, which is how quickly demand gets accelerated through the economy again once, the magic date, the 21st of June, arrives. And it's really not clear at this point. And we still have the ongoing threat of possible new strains of the virus that will hinder and slow down the reopening of the economy. We're just really not sure whether households are going to take a very cautious approach to spending again when it comes to the summer, knowing and remembering the pain of the past year, or whether they are going to want to just get out there and spend some of the income that some families have built up over this period. So there are so many unknowns in this. And ultimately, it's really whether these hospitality businesses end up being viable. It's not really going to be down to whether they get support from the Chancellor. It's really going to be about whether there is a genuine demand in the economy for those services. And that really probably all comes down to whether and how social distancing continues through the summer.
Yeah, you make a very good point there. Look at the front page of the Sunday Times, stealth rise in income tax to pay COVID bill. I mean, that's the thing, Rachel, isn't it? I mean, the Bank of England's chief economist said recently that we're going to be like a coiled spring, that there's a lot of sort of pent-up financial energy, and there needs to be, doesn't there, in order for us all to get out and spend again, to keep the economy going. Do you think it'll be there?
It depends which bit of the picture you're looking at. I think it's definitely true that there are a lot of people who, during the pandemic, have had an opportunity to save. I think they were dubbed the sourdough savers by some economists, just because, people with disposable income not having anywhere to dispose it. On the other hand, a lot of people have been really struggling and really hit in this pandemic. Household debt has risen during this pandemic. So, again, what we're looking at is a very real risk that the rampant inequalities we have in this country will deepen even further if the Chancellor does not manage the economy with a budget that is conscious of that. And unfortunately, I don't see any sign or any awareness of that with the things that are being trailed so far. So when we look at needing to stimulate the economy, I think that is absolutely true. But some of the ways that you stimulate the economy is to invest. You invest in skills, you invest in training. You might want to look at raising the living wage so that people have more money to spend in the economy. You might especially want to look at doing that for people who have borne the brunt of the pandemic, carried all the risk in the pandemic, so that we are able to come through it. So we're looking at frontline workers, not just NHS, but other frontline workers. They're the sort of people who I think deserve a pay raise, and it would be good to see that happen in this week's budget.
Anita, you've been shaking your head. Do you want to come back?
Well, I just think this is just not reflecting the reality that we've seen from the Chancellor, which is that the furlough scheme has kept a lot of people, particularly in hospitality, going. And that is what we're going to probably see extended through the budget. So I think the Chancellor is very conscious of those people that have been struggling the most. And secondly, on this point about the national living wage, we've just talked about how much of the hospitality industry might potentially go to the wall and how much they need an emergency injection of cash. If we combine that with an increase in the national living wage, that might be great for people that still have their jobs, but there's going to be an awful lot of people and an awful lot of businesses who will not be able to weather an increase in salary. So I think the Chancellor is taking a very cautious approach, but we'll see, and I'm expecting to see an uplift in UC, for instance, which I think is really speaking to that lower income group of people who've really struggled over the past year.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. We've got to go to the break. Thank you both. Full coverage, of course, of the budget here on Sky News on Wednesday. Coming up, doctors are warning of a mental health crisis among children and young people caused by the pandemic. Discussing that and more in a couple of minutes. Come back, time for part two of the press preview. Rachel and Anita still with me. Front page of the Observer, Rachel. I mean, children have really suffered, haven't they, as we know, over the last 12 months. The pandemic really has been extremely difficult for youngsters, and doctors now fear a new child mental health crisis.
Sadly, yes. I mean, you're absolutely right that children have had a really tough time over the last year. I think it's really hit young people hard. And now we're looking at some charitable mental health services saying that they're seeing a 70% rise in demand over the last 3 months, and they're expecting a surge in cases as schools reopen in the coming weeks. So this is a very grim picture. We often talk about the shelving of health concerns during the pandemic, people not getting the treatment that they need for various conditions. And of course, mental health is a massive component of that. Treatments that people are not receiving, or needs that have become more and more urgent as a result of the pandemic. So yes, a very grim picture for young people. And it is worth saying as well that child and adolescent mental health services were services really hit by austerity cuts in the last 10 years. They were hit particularly hard.
Yeah, of course. We'll move on to the front of the Sunday Telegraph, Anita. Of course, many of us still working from home, not me personally, but of course, many people are still doing that. Eventually, the government will want us to, at least part of the time, head back to the office. And this could be an incentive, flexible rail season tickets.
Well, I think this is almost an inevitable response to the market, given the reality that there's so much that's unknown about how often and how able we will be to get back into the office. And I'm one of the people, Jonathan, who sadly is working from home and is quite keen to get back to the office, maybe on a more flexible basis. But let's see the way that office models change through this pandemic. I definitely think that the trains have had a really difficult time. The government has spent a lot of money supporting economically. A lot of, for instance, TfL, who've come into a lot of, financial trouble due to the massive drop in demand. But really, I think it's quite early to be able to predict just how quickly we're all going to be cramming back onto trains again.
Yeah, there's been a shift, I think, hasn't there, in recent weeks? Certainly, anecdotally speaking to people I know who are now sort of saying what you're saying, really keen to start getting back to the office. Let's just finish with the front page of the Sunday Mirror. Rachel, what a lovely picture there of Tom, of course, Captain Sir Tom. His spirit lives on, his coffin wrapped in the Union Jack. And, what a man and what a send-off today.
Yeah, I think it was an incredibly dignified and moving send-off today. We saw Hannah Ingram Moore, his daughter, describe her father, Captain Sir Tom Moore, as a beacon of light and hope to the world. And I just think that that's such a beautiful sentiment and perfectly captures feelings around the world towards this incredible man, and obviously sending sympathies to all his family and loved ones.